The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Coming Together to Build Exceptional Products. This webinar will be a fireside chat with a PM from ProductPlan and a UX person from Pendo. Before we start, I would like to know who do we have on the line today. That way we can address this webinar and the questions according to you. So we're going to launch a poll, and I would like to ask everyone to take a brief moment to answer this poll. So if you're in product management, then select the first one. If you're a designer, then the second one. If you're part of the executive team, then the option number 3 is your option. And if you're in another job function, then please select other. I'm going to wait a few seconds here so that everybody had a moment to submit the answer. Looks like we got a lot of answers. Right on. So we have 62% that are in product management. Fantastic. There's lots of great recommendations from our speakers today for you. And not surprising, the second largest group are UX designers, given that it's a UX and PM topic. And we have a few executive and 10% on other job functions. Great. So today's webinar will be about working better together in between product managers and UX designers. And here at ProductPlan, we're doing an annual product planning survey. You can download that for free at productplan.com/report. And you can see that there is lots of challenges for product managers, but among the top challenges that we've identified this year was actually working together with UX team. And that's why we teamed up with Pendo, and Annie and Kelsey will be talking about their experience as a UX designer and as a PM on how to work better together, because working as a team can be hard. So our two speakers today, like I said, we have Kelsey Hughes, who is a UX designer at Pendo. Welcome, Kelsey. And Kelsey has a background in graphic design mixed with a passion for user research, which led her to a user experience role at the product team at Pendo. As an advocate for user testing, she's always looking for new tools and methods to enhance the process. And then we have Annie Dunham from ProductPlan. She's our director of product management. And Annie has worked with product and engineering teams for at least 15 years to bring technology products to the market. Before ProductPlan, she worked with teams at Elite Meetings, Logic Monitor, Blue Casa Communications, and Microsoft. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
When everybody registered for today's webinar, we ask you to submit your questions. What do you want to hear from Annie and Kelsey today? And we identified 5 patterns. It was interesting that really those 5 different themes were the themes where we had most of the questions. So today's webinar and the questions that we're going to address are all questions from you. And the 5 different themes that we identified is, first, people were interested in hearing about the responsibilities between product management and UX. And the next one was around the relationship between product managers and UX designers. Who is responsible and how to divvy up the different functions between those 2 roles. And then the next question was around a seamless process or process-related questions. How can we work better together, and who is driving what particular piece in the part of the process? And then the next one was just around tips and tricks. What tools do you use, and what have you learned and years of experience in order to achieve the best result? So those were the 4 different themes. I said 5. I guess the 5th theme really is the live Q&A. And I would encourage everybody to use the GoToWebinar question panel and submit questions at any time during the webinar. We set aside roughly 15 minutes at the end of the webinar after we go through the set of questions that you submitted that are related to those 4 different themes. And we collect them, and we try to do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So, but without further ado, I wanted to start this fireside chat and address all the questions that came in and have Annie and Kelsey kind of share their experiences. So first up, we wanted to hear, or the questions really were around responsibilities. And Annie, why don't you kind of share your thoughts and your ideas, how you define the role of product manager?
Sure. Hi, everyone. As Andre mentioned, I'm Annie Dunham, Director of Product here at ProductPlan. I'm very excited to be here with Kelsey talking about the role between and the relationship between product and UX. It is a topic that comes up in almost all product process discussions, and it's a relationship I put a lot of value in. I believe that the collaboration between the teams is one of the largest influencers in product success. So in terms of the product role itself, I look at product as owning the what of the product process, or another way to look at it is product is responsible for building the right thing at the right time, which means balancing a number of factors. We're looking at business needs, strategic initiatives, the customer needs or the customer benefits we want to deliver, what's happening in the competitive landscape, stakeholder interests, feasibility, opportunity cost, prioritization, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to balance around what and when things should be done. And it also means obsessively keeping everybody informed about what's happening, what product is doing, and why. In terms of the process itself, there's an exceptional amount of overlap with user experience. And I think that is something that is going to continue to grow as both roles evolve with time. So I'm really happy we're here to talk a little bit more about how to understand how the role and relationship work together.
Right on. Thanks, Annie. So Kelsey, why don't you share your definition of UX UI? What's a UX designer responsible for, and what's your definition of that role?
Yeah, well, hey everyone, I'm Kelsey and user experience designer here at Pendo. And honestly, I agree a lot with Andy that there's a ton of overlap between the two roles. We're working together all the time. There's a ton of collaboration, and we each do have our own individual responsibilities though. So UX can range anywhere from user research, defining user roles, journey mapping, wireframing, creating mockups, and then also being able to balance any technical development decisions with our design and interaction decisions. So we're really focused on the how and the holistic view of the product. So not only how it looks, but how it feels and how the user interacts with it.
Very important. So one question that came in, maybe Annie, you kind of share your thoughts on that question first, and Kelsey, I'm curious to hear your perspective as a designer. How do you delineate the responsibilities between what the product manager does and what the UX designer does?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think at the forefront, looking at it as the what for product side or building the right thing, and UX looking at making sure they're delivering the right look, that it feels right, that it behaves right, is a very simplistic way to look at it. And in terms of ownership, that works well. Product's going to make the final call around scope and timing and when something's happening. UX is going to make the final call around the look, the feel, and potentially workflows. In the real world, that means an incredible amount of collaboration to make sure that you guys are solving the right problem, that you're working together, that you've identified the right problem, and that you've found a solution that's really going to work.
Yeah, I agree. Figuring out up front who can kind of take what responsibilities is going to be really important, but then also being able to pick up after one another during the process and being able to, both have context for what each other is doing and being able to speak to certain decisions that are being made on both the design side and the product management side.
Awesome. Thanks, both of you. So let's kind of dive in a bit more now that we understand your definitions of those roles into what's the relationship between product and UX. But before we do that, I would like to launch another poll and kind of hear the audience's opinion on how you work together. So if UX and product is in the same department, please select option number 1. If UX and product are in different departments, option number 2. And we've also noticed with some of the questions coming in, sometimes you can be both. You can be the designer and you can be the product managers. And then please select option number 3. Or if none of those apply to you, then option number 4. I give everybody a few seconds here to submit their votes until I share the results. All right, looks like a lot of people had a chance to vote. Let me close the poll and share the results. Okay, so the vast majority, more than 50%, is where UX and product is in the same department. That's something that I've been used to in the past, so it's not surprising to me. I'm surprised that actually 36% are different departments. That's very interesting. And very few on the line right now were wearing both hats. That's good. I think it can be very challenging to be the designer and also the product manager, and 3% are other. Any thoughts on this, Kelsey or Annie? Surprising or not surprising?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that the UX and product are in the same department. That's how we function here at Pendo, and it's been really successful. So I'm glad to see that the majority of the people are in that field.
Right on. Let's talk about the relationship. So again, this is a fireside chat. So all the questions that I'm going to address to Annie and Kelsey were questions that you submitted. Thank you very much for that. And also a quick reminder that we do a live Q&A at the end. So if you have a question that we're not going to address, please submit them during the webinar at any time. So the first question here is, I guess around, we have an idea how the roles are defined. So which role product managers and UX designers play in an organization, but there's obviously a fair amount of interaction and overlap. So the question here is, how do you find PM and UX work best together? And what does your ideal relationship look like? We addressed some of that, but Annie, what are your thoughts? What's the perfect relationship? How can people work perfectly together?
I'm doing my best to hold my smart wit on that comment. But okay, so first I think it's really important that you define the playing field. You need to understand what your common goals are. What is the goal that you are working together as a team to achieve? And then also understand make sure you're aligned in terms of what your roles are. And remember that you're both people. You're coming to the table with different strengths, different interests, and there might be some flexibility around how you actually divide the ownership and the roles there. But taking the time to understand how you're going to work together and the goal that you're trying to achieve, I think is exceptionally important. And then from there, you build the collaboration and respect, really learn from each other and use those interactions to make a better product. And for example, we might decide that product always owns discovery, but there might be a project where I walk into a room, UX has done a ton of research around the specific topic, and they really have more empathy for the customer in that situation. I can recognize that and move quickly into the design element because I can trust that they know and they're going to share what they know. On another hand, there might be a new project where it's new to the company. It's something that we're looking at from ground up. It's come from a lot of inputs. And I'm walking in the conversation with wireframes. Now, I'm not necessarily walking in because I think that's the solution, but it's a way for me to communicate what I'm thinking, and it's a starting place for the conversation. So I think flexibility, once you have that playing field, is exceptionally important.
Kelsey, do you agree? Other thoughts, additional thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think, my ideal working relationship is that we can kind of come together and, again, identify the playing field, figure out what the overall objectives are, agree on those, and then we can divide and conquer on some of the tasks. So, we can divide and conquer on some of the smaller things like scheduling user interviews or writing out some product requirements and things like that. But then it's ultimately good to come back together when you're iterating on actual wireframes and mockups and flows. That's something that I can go away and into my little cave and do, but it's so important to over communicate and be really iterative with the process. So that's what I found to be kind of my ideal relationship with that.
Good advice. A good follow-up question here. Some people have identified that they're working in different departments, so I would assume perhaps there's some other objectives. So when working together, how do you establish an objective view? Annie, what are your thoughts?
So I think I really like what Atlassian says about the topic, that you should be as transparent as possible and make sure all the information is available to everyone. You should be asking yourself, what do I need to hold back instead of what do I need to share? And I think as product managers, we commonly think that we're repeating ourselves over and over again. And I don't think that's how other people see it. I don't think there's too much sharing that you can do. And that specifically comes into play in the UX and product relationship around the roadmap and where you're headed strategically. I think if you can build that alignment, not only do you start to generate a lot of excitement around what you're doing and why you're doing it, but you can also, from the PM side, help people understand why you're making some of the timing and scope decisions you need to make, because they have a better view of the projects overall that'll be impacted. So that's one side of the objective view. The other side's just around data. You are, as much as you might love what you're doing or be passionate about your design, you are doing it for a desired outcome. There are KPIs tied to that desired outcome, and there's a way to evaluate if what you are doing is having the impact that you need it to have. So making sure product and UX are aligned in terms of what needle you're trying to move and what you think is going to help move that needle can really help in the decision-making and collaboration process.
Yeah, definitely agree on all the roadmap alignment. And we've found that when we bring other people into our process, that they can bring a point of view that is really good and kind of keeps us in check with what we're trying to solve. So whether it's developers or all the way up to key stakeholders, everyone has a perspective. And so we like to try to share as often as possible and kind of create steering committees for some of these things. So that's been really helpful.
I enjoy that both of you are on the same page. So maybe let's mix it up a little bit. Like I said earlier, a lot of people identified in our planning survey that it can be challenging. So let's talk about the challenges. Annie, what are some of the challenges that you as a PM may encounter in your career when working with UX people? And Kelsey, what are some challenges that you want to share with the audience that you have had in the past with PMs?
Kelsey, go ahead. I'll let you go first.
Well, to start off, I think it's really good when you have a comfortable enough a relationship that you can debate and have challenges throughout the process. I think that's what ultimately, creates a better product, is when you feel comfortable asking challenging questions to one another and forcing the other to take a stance on it or really rethink, their approach. So that's kind of one thing I wanted to note. But another challenge that I frequently have is kind of when it comes down to the wire and there's deadlines and there's this push to get things released to a customer. Sometimes we have to sacrifice our design decisions for the sake of the business and the product manager. So that's where I find a lot of my challenges, and it's kind of my job to go back and prioritize with the PM what do we think really is going to be the most valuable out of the laundry list of things that are left to do. And again, I think data is great, and we can use all of our customer interviews and things like that to help us kind of prioritize that list. So it's definitely a challenge, and it gets sad sometimes when certain design decisions don't get to be made, but it's just part of the process, and we'll always learn from it.
Sounds like data is the great objective unifier. Annie, what do you think? What are some challenges that you've encountered in the past?
So I came into product from a project management background where it was very efficiency minded. It was very much about, what's the dependency? How quickly do we get the next thing out the door? And so working with UX forced me to change that a little bit, because you can't walk in as a product manager to UX conversation and say, here's a problem, here's how I want to solve it, and I need to design in 2 days. For UX to be really effective, it took me a long time to realize I needed to build the space in for the converge, diverge, exploration. That's where innovation comes from. And as somebody who's not naturally very patient, that was hard for me to learn to prepare for. And now that I have that in mind going into a project, that becomes much easier. But I think that that's not uncommon. Product managers are looking at the longer term goal, designs coming in from a different angle, and they need a different amount of space for that creativity. And if you don't create that space, you really risk the longer term customer perspective. At the same time, I've been in situations where UX will walk in the room with the product solution through like phase 6, and it's not realistic for the business to get to phase 6 as much as we would all like to. So I think a lot of communication needs to happen about the why and that it's a compromise on the product side as well. It's not that we like saying no, there's just other things that we're trying to balance.
Awesome, good advice. Let's move on to our next section. There were a lot of questions around process. Tell me how you do things. What's the process at ProductPlan? What's the process at Pendo? But before we share, or Kelsey and Annie share their thoughts, curious to hear your opinion on how do you prioritize? Is it mainly that the executive team makes the decision and prioritizes who needs to work on what? Is it mainly driven by product management and they make the priorities? Are the customers the ultimate tiebreaker and ultimately driving most of your roadmap? Or is it the mix of all of the three things above? So please take a moment and submit your answer. I'm curious to hear how you prioritize, or who really is prioritizing in your organization. Let's give everyone here a moment to submit the votes. I know there was a question that came in, how many people submit the polls? So we have several hundred people on the line right now. And usually I wait until like 70 to 80% of the people voted so that we have a pretty objective result here. Right now we reached the 80% mark. Let me close the poll and share the results. Okay, not surprising that it's not really only one thing that makes the priority, which is good. You usually want to look at things from a different perspective. So the majority of people have a mix here. And then looks like PMs are the second largest group in regards to who decides the priority, followed by executives, and then 8% selected my roadmap or my priorities are entirely customer driven. Not a bad thing. Any thoughts, Annie or Casey, on this? Is it surprising, or is this what do you expect?
I don't find it overly surprising. I think it is an underlying challenge, as we talk a lot about how much product needs to be data-driven and KPI-driven, that when priorities are coming from a number of different places, that can make that a little more interesting. But to have it split like this doesn't surprise me.
Yeah,
Cool.
Agreed.
Kelsey?
Oh yeah, I agree as well.
Got it. Cool. Let me close this and move on. Process. So what are some workflows that lead to exceptional products? Of course, Kelsey and Annie only worked at companies with exceptional products, so love to hear advice on this. So the first question here is, can you give us a high-level view of how you see the process happening from the point where a customer benefit or feature or project has been identified to when it's handed to engineering? Kelsey, do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So we kind of have a mix as well of when that kind of product decision is being made. So it's usually typically our product manager and executives. And then we really get UX involved as soon as possible. And we start brainstorming, and we do a lot of that converging where we, just whiteboard a lot of things out and come up with a list of open questions that we want to answer. And so we'll go back and forth and do this a lot. And we love to do user interviews, of course, so that we can, validate some of our, upfront assumptions. And so we do all of that, and then kind of take it through development. And we're very agile here, so there is oftentimes where we will go into development and then make some design and product decisions changes along the way. So it's really always an experiment and working process that we go through here.
Always love hearing both of those perspectives. So Annie, how does it look on your end, or from your perspective?
Yeah, it looks something like the image we're looking at, except for about 1,000 more arrows looping around.
I would agree with that part as well.
But I think overall, we've talked about sort of roles and responsibilities. When I look at the process itself, you look at discovery, I'm assuming product is owning discovery in as much as they're driving, who's going to be talked to, probably scheduling calls, determining how much information needs to be gathered, but that is UX is invited to those calls, at least has access to recordings, has the ability to ask questions, that's not a product specific function. And then moving into design, you would assume that's sort of UX's role, but obviously products in the room, making sure the designs are, that you're coming back and converging, still solving the right problem. And I love that the test is the next step here, because you as UX and product might not agree on the solution at all. And there might be data that can give you a good answer, but I love the notion of a customer being the tiebreaker. Get a customer on the phone. And that doesn't mean that, I as product think we need right click and Kelsey thinks that we need a new button in the toolbar, and we call and we say to the customer, how do you feel about right click? But we might put a few, we're trying to solve a problem. We're trying to help the customer get to an action within the product. So we help them look at a few prototypes and see, do they use right click? Can they get to that action faster? If we put it in a toolbar, can they get to that action faster? What's the data that will confirm we're actually solving the customer problem we think we want to solve? And I would also add, in all of these phases, bring engineering in as early as you can, understand what some of the feasibility challenges are. More importantly, help them understand the problem that you're trying to solve, so that when you move into the build phase, they have a really good understanding in those compromise decisions, what really matters and what doesn't. So again, build is probably what you would consider being an engineering phase, but UX and product are right there. You are constantly looking and evaluating at what options you have. Do you need to invest the extra development time to really make sure that button works the way you anticipated, or is that something you can compromise on? What are the real objectives? And then at the end of all of it, you've got to measure what you've done. You did this for a reason. I've talked to plenty of people who have launched things, and it is the hardest thing to launch a product and see it not move the needle the way you thought it would move. But it's worse to launch it, have it not move the needle, have it sit out there and make things worse. So you've got to be making sure that you're keeping that data in mind throughout.
Again, data.
Data.
I love that the customer is a tiebreaker. I think that's a very good point. A good follow-up question here. I think both of you addressed a little bit the first part of this. When should UX get involved? So I think we don't need to follow up on this. But the second part is, should UX be part of the discovery process? You talked a bit about the once you start building, I suppose. What about discovery? Kelsey, do you think that it's important that UX is involved early on, or should they not be bogged down with perhaps all the different ideas or all the different requests from customers?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be actively involved in the discovery. I think Annie mentioned earlier, there's learnings that both I and the product manager have had. We both know the product really well. We've both talked to customers, so there's times where we can bring in value early in the discovery to help kind of guide decisions, or where else to keep looking in that part of the process. So I think it's really important. I don't always think it's necessary, but I think speaking from my point of view, I'll try to do some discovery on my own anyways. So it's just much easier if we kind of get together and do it at the beginning. So.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, in my ideal world, UX and PM are, arm in arm, monkey style, going through the whole thing. But there are also the efficiency parts of the process itself. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to put people in the room for certain calls. There's conflicts. There's other projects you need to move. You just need to make sure you're in sync in terms of what's happening and who's going to own which parts of that.
Yeah, I agree. There's a couple of questions that are very specific UX questions and one question very specific product. So Kelsey, this one is for you. It's very specific to UX. How does your team prop up a prototype for user feedback? When customers are interacting with it, what are you looking for when you create a prototype?
Yeah, so we typically use InVision for all of our prototyping, especially when talking with customers. They make it really easy to export our screens and link them together, and we can share a link with a customer really simply. So kind of after we've put a prototype together, or a couple versions of a prototype together to test amongst various customers, we generally schedule a call with the help of our customer success team, or sometimes we'll even launch a poll in Pendo and ask if anyone's interested in being kind of a user test subject. So it's really cool that we can kind of have multiple ways of recruiting for those users. But once we get them on the line, we typically just do a screen share, and there are a couple different tasks that we have that we're validating for. There's some assumptions that we've already made, so we really want to check and see, is something discoverable? What's the overall comprehension of this prototype and of this task that we're trying to get our user to do? So we also like to keep pretty open, and we request from our users to think out loud as much as possible, because we'll get a lot of really great ad hoc feedback and kind of ask them to, before they click on something, what are their expectations that they think are going to happen. So we'll definitely get a lot of feedback that way, and it's sometimes, you know, on things that we weren't even testing for, but it's really good that we can kind of, you know, keep that up. So awesome. That's kind of how we do it here. So yeah.
Good advice. Thanks for sharing. Annie, next one I think is for you as a product manager. And I know sometimes product managers do design. And so the question is, how hi-fi should wireframes be? Should they replace written requirements? And what should be handed over to engineers?
That's one of those very definitive product management questions where it's a strong maybe. Like, there's a lot of factors there. So I think what's most important is that engineers understand the problem that you're trying to solve and why you're trying to solve it, and what your proposed solution is. I think wireframes themselves replace the 75-page if-then documents that product managers used to put together, but they don't necessarily replace all of the written information. So as long as the engineers have context, they understand what the objective is, how hi-fi that wireframe is really depends on the project itself. If it is something that is very analogous to something that's in your product already, you can get them most of the way through explaining, you know, we're going to do this like that, and here are the changes. That works. In our case, we find hi-fi wireframes to be very helpful because we have a lot of our team working asynchronously, so they're all working towards a common goal. We also know, though, going in, that time that was put in for that picture-perfect design is going to be compromised. There are things we're going to have to move around, but we go in with that knowledge.
Awesome. Let's move on to our next section. Again, as always, we're going to start with a poll. So the next question or next section is around tips and tricks. And we thought we might want to check in how many tools, how many software vendors do you use in your organization? Do you feel like you have too many tools, or is it just the right amount of tools, or are you doing your designs in PowerPoint and your roadmaps in Excel, and you really need more tools in order to get the job done more efficiently? I will give everybody a moment here to submit their answers. Curious to hear how people answer on this poll. Answers are coming in. Let's give everybody a few more seconds here. Right on. We reached our 70% threshold. Let me share the results. Thanks to everybody who submitted the question here. All right, looks like the majority of you have just the right amount of tools. Fantastic, you're in a good spot. Looks like the next one is that there is perhaps some solutions that could help in a few areas, and 23% think there's too much software going on in the organization. Right on. Tips and tricks. All right. I would love to hear Kelsey's and Annie's tools of the trade, tips and tricks, how to get stuff done. We got lots of questions around that. And there's a couple questions probably specifically for UX and one question for product. So let's start with Kelsey. This one I think is specifically to you as a designer. What tools do you recommend to foster collaboration between the product and UX teams?
So I have a lot of really great tools that I like to use and that we found kind of work well here. But I think ultimately finding a tool that will work, you know, best for both parties is really the ultimate goal. So trying to find a common ground in a tool can be really important. So for example, we found that, you know, we try to use a lot of different tools at times, but we always come back to Google Slides and PowerPoint. It's such a good common ground for us to be able to quickly iterate. We can create quick, clickable prototypes. You just go from one slide to the next, and there's commenting, and you know, we just always keep kind of coming back to this as this like living and breathing working document, you know, at the front of our projects. And then, you know, then I'll typically go into some more of design tools, and again, we'll use InVision for prototyping, and there's some great comment functionality there too, because I think it's really great to be able to comment in line and be able to kind of work that way with both the product manager and the designer. But there are a lot of great tools out there, again, like InVision or Confluence are all really good for some of that collaboration. But don't underestimate good old Google Slides or PowerPoint.
I agree. I know we use InVision here at ProductPlan as well, and we love it. The next one is for you, Annie. And the question is, how do you identify KPIs and tie them to the roadmap?
So I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is really how do you identify KPIs for the specific feature or product you're working on? And I've talked to a lot of product managers, and I've seen this work best when it comes from the top, when there's initial KPI the business is trying to move, or set of two. The product manager then is identifying their 2 or 3 products or features that they're going to work on that move that needle. So for example, if the company has said churn is very important this year, the product manager might identify 3 features they believe is going to increase engagement. So for their first feature, they're going to have a measure of that engagement element, and they're also going to have a measure of that churn KPI. So you have 2 numbers that you're kind of watching as you put that feature together. And then when you look at the actual roadmap, one of the things we do here is we make sure everything is color-coded based on that strategic initiative. So you can get a single view of the initiative, or the churn number in this case that you're trying to move, and all of the elements that line up to meet that objective. It makes it a much more, I want to say objective, but at least clear view of what exactly you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it's going to help the business move forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. Next question that I would love to hear both of your opinion on, and the last section was around kind of an agile workflow, and this is related to this a little bit. How should we balance having a working design at the beginning of a project that is user tested versus agile learning as you go? Kelsey, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that in general, there's going to always be parts of the wireframes in the project that are working. It takes a lot of effort and time to be 100% solid on your design upfront. So it's good to definitely map out things that that won't change, or that are kind of maybe 100% that you have validated. But you can't get too attached to any of the design or product decisions that you've made. So that's what kind of found that it's a tough balance, but if you don't get attached to anything, then you can always make kind of a change when you hear from users and how they actually interact with the product. So,
Annie, what do you think?
No, I agree completely, and actually have a peer who tells her team from the beginning, don't fall in love with anything you do. And it's not that you're not supposed to be passionate, but you can't be too tied to exactly what you have in front of you at the moment. You have to expect some amount of evolution. And I think the underlying question there, though, is how much do you need for the place that you're at? Sometimes you really have to go to the extreme with the design to understand if you're solving the problem correctly. At other times, it's clear from the beginning there's incremental steps, and then you can work through the incremental designs.
So let me kind of follow up on that, Annie. Mm-hmm. So when do you think, after working through the different iterations of the design, when is it ready for engineering? And when do you involve engineering?
So I think ideally you involve engineering very early. I mean, they're seeing some of the iterations because they can help you identify very quickly some of the conflicts you might be introducing, some things that might seem really challenging to you, but there's a great component for that can make it much easier. The sooner you can get them involved, the better. But in terms of actually handing it off, when you're actually getting to the point of saying, okay, in the next sprint, the next 2 sprints, we're going to start allocating resources to this project. It's a really good time to start reviewing and making sure that you have their questions answered.
What do you think, Kelsey? Agree?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of times in our grooming sessions where we'll bring designs to the table, and they ask the best questions that we'll have to kind of go back and maybe quickly iterate on. But I think, ultimately that they're asking excellent questions. So, we love to involve them as soon as possible.
Kelsey, good follow-up question. Love to hear your thoughts on that, and Annie, you too. What is the most effective way to brief a team from product to design to marketing, and then I guess about the upcoming product features? How do you brief a team, and what's effective that you have experienced?
Yeah, so We have recently started using Confluence, and so that's been a really great way. But similarly before, we just have a working kind of Google Doc where there's kind of key objectives and things that we're trying to solve for. So we just outline everything there, and it's kind of this this breathing document, if you will, where you can go in and comment on it and make changes, and I can toss in some wireframes for developers or anyone else in the company to kind of reflect on. And so I think just having some kind of centralized place is really the best way to then share that out to members of the team. And then we also have some product working sessions here. And so while that's not really necessarily other members in the organization, it does kind of open it up to our broader product team. And it's just good, again, to get that collaboration, their feedback, because we're oftentimes kind of heads down in one project. So it's good to open it up and breathe for a little bit and get some feedback.
Right on. Annie, what do you think? What is effective? What have you found effective to brief teams?
Very similarly, I love the notion of a living, breathing document. From the moment you identify that this is something you need to work on, a place where you're noting user stories, business case, hypotheses, ways you'll measure success, through requirements where everybody has access to that information as early as possible. But just making it open, I found that doesn't actually make people accountable for knowing what they need to know. So there are times, especially for larger projects, where it's really good to have a kickoff where everybody from marketing, potentially a sales representative, customer success is around even before the work begins. And, you have a meeting invite. Clearly they were there. They were told. They can't pretend they weren't told whenever that is 3 months later. Making sure there's that regular update. And, as I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the key things for a product manager is over communication. And I don't know that I believe you can over communicate. So.
Yeah, we also have Slack channels, which is kind of similar to a kickoff. We'll launch a Slack channel that anyone in the company can join, and we try to post kind of status and our open questions as we're working in that channel, so anyone in the company can kind of follow along, and we found that to be a good way to involve others.
Awesome. Let's do a quick summary on those 4 different patterns on the questions that everybody submitted, and then we can move on to my favorite section, the live questions. We've got lots and lots of questions that are coming in. And like I said, we collect them all. And please continue to ask your questions, and we're trying our best to get through as many questions as possible. But Kelsey, why don't you kind of share some of your high-level thoughts on the key takeaways on those 4 patterns, and then Annie, maybe you can chime in with your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, as Annie mentioned earlier, clearly defining the roles up at the front is so important. That way you're not stepping on each other's toes throughout the process, and you're not doing double work. So, it's great to collaborate, but it's also good to take some ownership and be able to go away and create a user flow and not have your PM go create the same thing. So, again, as you mentioned earlier, that over communication is really important here so that you can define your roles.
Yeah, and then jumping over to your objectives, I think it's part of the playing field. And if you are aligned on what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're going to know if you did it, you can agree to disagree, and where your decisions are going to be made, and have a more objective view of the process itself.
Right on.
And I think it's important to play to your strengths. So, we can both bring valuable things to the table, and we both have different experiences on projects that we've worked with or companies we've worked with in the past, and different just types of people that we've worked with. So depending on the project, you might have a different skill set for that, or a relationship with someone like a customer that you can divide and conquer, how you communicate with them. So I think it's really important to, when you define your roles, be able to also identify what are your key strengths that you're bringing to the table for the project.
Yeah, and then the last one we mentioned on here is listen to each other, but I'd almost rephrase it to have fun. I mean, the PM-UX relationship not only is incredibly collaborative, it's where innovation can happen, it's where creativity happens. It can be some of the most fun work you get to do. So if you can have that healthy relationship, it's not only good for the business, it can be a lot of good for you.
Good summary. Thanks, both of you. All right, like I said, let's move on to my favorite part. And keep those questions coming, please. And we got lots of them. Let's try to address as many as possible. So the first one is, for both of you guys. Maybe Annie, if you can tackle this one first, and then Kelsey, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. It's kind of around the future. Where do you see these two roles, PM and UX, heading in the future? Will they converge or diverge?
I think they are continually evolving. I think the areas where they overlap currently is going to continue to converge. I think UX is going to start taking over more of the discovery elements. I think you're going to see people hired into UX roles really to bring more innovation into the product process. At the same time, I think you're going to see an evolution for what product is doing outside of the standard product process around the strategy elements, the communication elements. So I think you're going to see some of both. I think where they are today, there's going to be ever growing overlap, but I also think there's going to be new responsibilities.
Yeah, in the near future, I definitely think the roles will converge, but I don't necessarily think that means that they can be tackled by one person. I still think it's really important to have at least two different people coming together and being able to, collaborate and debate against each other and be able to divide and conquer and do different tasks in the project. So while, the PM can do tasks that the UX designer does and vice versa, it's always good to have an extra set of hands and someone to bounce ideas off of. So I definitely think, the responsibilities will converge a little bit. But with UX in general, there's also, it's a growing field. So there's a ton of smaller things that designers can go into as well. You can focus on specifically interaction design or user research. So there's tons of possibilities that are open.
Good. The next one, I've been working in technology for over 15 years, and technology can tend to be male-dominated, such as other industries. I'm stoked to have a female product manager and a female UX designer on the panel sharing their expert advices. Do you two have advice for other women out there how to work in a male-dominated space? Annie, do you want to start on this one?
It's a topic that's everywhere right now, right? And it's something that's certainly been more and more of a topic over the years, but currently in the state of the news. It's complicated. We could probably do an entire webinar on that topic alone. But what I will say is for women who feel like they're in a male-dominated space, I mean, you are, but especially in your personal environment, is first to just take a step back and look at communication styles. There's times where there are just issues with the team in terms of how people are respecting each other, communicating with each other. And there are consultants and personality tests and all kinds of ways to approach those very solvable issues. When it's a bigger issue than that, I recommend finding an ally, somebody who can give you objective feedback about you as a person in your career. It can also be an advocate for change where change needs to happen. I know just as many women who have told they are too apologetic as I do have been told they're too aggressive. So I don't think there's some blanket behavior change everybody needs to consider. My other advice would be don't try to just be one of the guys. It's not about trying to find your way into the inner circle. It's about figuring out how we as women advocate change in a healthy work environment for each other. And lastly, there are great apps and anonymous groups. Blind App is one that comes to mind, where there are a lot of other women in technology who are there to offer advice. So if you have a specific situation, there's great ways to get feedback.
Kelsey, any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, just in general, I like to bring it back to data like we've been doing. I think everyone can align on a data point. So whether it's, product usage on your team or a customer feedback, you hear like a whole bunch of customers are thinking one way, it's really hard to disagree with that. So just always bringing kind of that data to the table when you're trying to make an argument or be in a meeting and present an idea. It's always been really helpful. So put it back on the customers, because regardless of male or female, they are your end goal and everyone can agree on that.
Yeah, so. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks for asking that question, and thanks both of you. I know it can be a tough question for sharing your thoughts on this topic. I appreciate that. And I just second Annie, like this is even more so an important topic today, in my opinion. Next question is for both of you. Let's talk about challenges again, or disagreements. How do you resolve any disagreement that product managers and UX people have on workflows or designs? Any advice on how to dissolve disagreements? Kelsey,
Yeah,
do you want to go first?
I agree with what Annie says earlier. I mean, we've done that as well. You know, you kind of work out a workflow and create a prototype, and you schedule a call with the customer, and you just kind of battle it out that way. And you know, you don't just show it to, like, you know, 2 people. You will show it to more, and you can kind of start to get some collective data on that. So I think that's a really great way to kind of work out any battles. And also just internally kind of use like user testing and sharing workflows and opening it up. You know, I'm never personally offended when we do disagree. It's, you know, again, ultimately what the customer is going to think is most successful. So the more people we can share it with, the better. And I'm happy to lose that battle any day.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, as product, I have to be willing to compromise on that. I mean, that's UX was brought in this role to really advise on workflows. And if it's going to completely change the scope of the project, which I've had it do, and we've sidelined projects because I've been wrong and that scope needed to change. But if I am going to defer at the end of the day to UX, to something that is testable. That doesn't mean that I agree, but it means that I'm willing to say, okay, between the two, we're going to try what you have in front of us. We're going to test it, and we're going to see where we need to evolve.
Good advice. Both UX and product managers work for the same end goal. So that's always good to remember. Next one is for you, Kelsey. The question is, what do you need from product to get started on your designs on UX, UI?
Yeah, so to be just general, I need a why. So I always like to understand, why are we actually doing this? Why are you asking me to kind of put this into a design? But like, really, that's all I really need to get initially started, because then I'll start asking questions. Once I get a general, you know, kind of overview of the why, I can ask questions and be able to identify some goals with my PM of what we're trying to solve. And you know, we really prioritize together at times. So you know, they have their end business goal and prioritization, but you know, I do have an opinion and I have feedback from just experience with customers and things like that. So I can help there as well. So yeah, I found that I don't need too much upfront, other than just, you know, the willingness to keep questioning the initial request.
Right on. Next question for both of you. Maybe Annie, you can start sharing your thoughts on this. How do you balance ideal UX and product scope? For example, PM is interested in getting a feature out quickly, but sounds like the UX proposals perhaps are like too perfect and would take too long to implement. So how do you manage scope, in particular from a UX perspective?
So I think there's 2 extremes, really. And you know, I just mentioned there was a project that we actually sidelined. This was a couple of years ago, where I went to my UX counterpart and said, look, we need a feature where people can just drop some notes over here in a side panel. And he went and did a little more discovery and come back and said, you're opening up a can of worms. What they really want is this much broader scope. This is the problem they're really trying to solve. And he was right on. What I was proposing was not actually going to bring the customer benefit that we needed. What he was proposing was something we didn't have time for. So we made the agreement that we were going to sit on that and tackle something that was a little more short term and had customer benefit right away. On the other hand, in the ideal UX, one of the ways we look at things now is, what are the bite-sized pieces? We've agreed on the end goal, but how do we iteratively deliver this so the customer's not waiting 6 months for that final benefit, that they're getting little pieces of it along the way? When we're able to do that, that works really well. It also gives us data halfway through the process to see how much farther is reasonable to go. Did we overestimate how much people would use this, and maybe do we need to consider waiting on phase 4, 5, and 6? Or did we underestimate it, and there's so much interest in this, we should actually reprioritize how quickly we go through those other pieces?
Any additional thoughts, Kelsey?
I just think, as the UX designer, our job is to also, you know, identify consistencies and patterns that we already have existing in our product. So, you know, our goal is to be able to use that to help not create kind of this massive scope. But I also agree on being able to test in smaller parts is really valuable, because you can see if you're building the right thing or not at all. So I definitely agree with that.
Right on. Thanks everybody for submitting so many questions. Let's try to get a few more here, and we're getting close to the hour. But awesome questions. Thanks so much. Next question is for both of you guys, and maybe Kelsey, you can share your thoughts first on this. What are your thoughts on having a designated UX researcher?
Well, I think that would be awesome. I would love to have that. I mean, I think it's super valuable. But in most organizations, or at least that I've had experience with, we haven't had that luxury. So while I do think it's super important, we rely a lot on our individual experience from the past. We rely on, customer success to be able to help us, and just, everyone's learnings from our, from our company. So again, I think it'd be great, but it's maybe not always practical. So.
Yeah, if you can do it, but it's not always something that that works for all teams.
Cool. Next question, maybe Annie, you can share your thoughts on this. As a product manager, how much technical depth is needed in your user stories and specifications?
That's interesting, because technical depth, it depends on what the user story is. If you're trying to solve something that's a technical issue, you need to clearly define what that technical issue is. In terms of architecture decisions, I'm not walking to my engineering team and telling them which React component to use. That's what they're experts in. Speed might be a concern. That might be the issue, but I'm trusting them to be the ones who can best address those technical problems.
Right on. Okay, so the next one is probably a good one for you, Kelsey. The question is, do you create wireframes or prototypes for every single project?
Yeah, that is a good question. So most of the times, yes, I actually do. But the level to what that wireframe looks like can definitely vary. So I use a tool called Balsamic, which is a very rough prototyping wireframing tool. And everything is in Comic Sans, and it's, not shaped lines. And so it's definitely a mess. So sometimes that's what we can deliver. But for the most part, we try to do some kind of wireframe, because, you can't just always add in something and not think about the other pieces of the product that it's affecting. So, yeah, but, also having great UX patterns and designs, that kind of does allow for you to skip over that wireframe process. So just depending on where your company and team is at in that process, you could skip over some really small things. But I generally find that creating a wireframe and a prototype for most things is really helpful for, buy-in through the product team, and then also with our developers. It just really helps them be able to get context and understand the flow.
What do you think, Annie? Do you agree?
Yeah.
Wireframe was every single project?
I think where it adds value, if you're just duplicating what a few words are going to say because of the issue at hand, then no. But anything that is big enough to be deemed a project, typically wireframe's helpful.
Got it. Next question, Annie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this first. And I know this applies to us here at ProductPlan. How do you deal with different people working the problem at different stages? We struggle with get engineering involved early, but different people work on the implementation. Any thoughts on this question?
I think, there's a philosophical question here about overlap in general. I don't think that it's a bad thing to have engineering involved early and have different people be on the implementation. You want your engineering team as a whole to have a really good idea about your entire product, what all the feature set does and why it does it. And you never know if that person who was involved early is going to be working on an enhancement for that project a year down the line. So there's the question of efficiency, which is always near and dear to my heart, but I don't think that outweighs the benefits you get from having engineering at the table early in the process.
What do you think, Kelsey? Any additional thoughts?
I agree. No additional thoughts there. I think just as early and often as possible, and even including engineering in product discussions and usability testing is really important, and they find value in it as well.
Good. Kelsey, good question for you. What do you document, and how do you document through this long, I assume, UX process?
Yeah, so just on a day-to-day, I use Evernote to document a lot of stuff. So that's kind of what I call my Kelsey brain dump document because it's really quick for me to toggle back and forth between different projects or different things that I'm kind of balancing for my day-to-day. But then ultimately I kind of go back to that central place where the whole project team is documenting. So yeah, but I'll document all of our user interviews and usability tests. So whether that's sharing notes or sharing a video link, I'll get that. And then wireframes, user flows, all of that is kind of in a central place as well. So I'm a very visual person, so any kind of diagram that we have or whiteboard session that we have, we're always taking pictures of it and making sure that we're referencing that.
Right on. I know we reached the top of the hour. I appreciate that everybody was so active and everybody was submitting so many questions. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Annie, for sharing your thoughts. I know there is an event coming up that Pendo is hosting. Kelsey, do you want to share some more details on the event that's coming up?
Yeah, next week in San Francisco, we're hosting a half-day session where there'll be some really great speakers as well as a networking lunch. So just a lot of great product sessions, and you can come meet the people of Pendo. So definitely feel free to check that out on the link in there.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thanks everyone for attending this webinar. We had several hundred attend. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the questions that you submitted during the registration process and during the live webinar. Both of our products have free trials. If you haven't checked out ProductPlan, I would encourage you to go on our website and sign up for a free trial. And if you haven't checked out Pendo, please do the same and go to pendo.io and check out the free trial. And yeah, that's the end of the webinar. That's a wrap. Thanks, Annie, again. Thanks, Kelsey, for just answering all those questions that were coming in. Good advice.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.